with talking about the effective communication in the school community. I have a timing of 20 minutes, so I'm going to ask my husband to give me the clock so that I do not go over. Before I get started, I just want to gauge the temperature in the room as we talk about communication in school. Communication in school is one of the most passionate places that we experience communication. Because our common goal is what? What is our common goal? Somebody, anyone? Education, educating our students. So both teachers, parents, and community, our passion is to educate our children. And so I just want to get a temperature of the room, and you can, on a scale of 1 to 5, so when I ask the question, you can just put up your hand. 1 being communication at Bermuda Institute, non-existent, 5 being amazing. How would you rate communication currently that you are experiencing at Bermuda Institute? So we're going to rank, so from 1 to 5, you can just put up your finger. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
3.
Just so that we can get a gauge. One of the things that's really important as a community, thank you, is that when we have these conversations, these open conversations, that we're transparent. And we're in an environment that's safe and trusting. So nothing that's said here tonight would be held against anyone, right? This is an open conversation because we are the Bermuda Institute community. Yes? Does anyone have a handout? Raise your hand if you need the handout so you can follow along. So who is in our school community? We have the principal, we have teachers, staff, we have parents, we have students, we have family members, we have community partners, so we can look at sports teams, church communities, and then we just have community members. So if we look at community members, it could be marketplace, it could be the store down the road. Our community partners are all of us, okay? Let's define what communication is. So the definition is the exchange of information by speaking, writing, or using some other form of medium. As we know, we're in a society now where we use text message, WhatsApp, email, and so any type of communication, whether it's writing, speaking, nonverbal, or verbal, those are all forms of communication. What are some communication barriers that we sometimes have? One can be cultural diversity. When we have a community such as a school community, we are coming from all different cultural backgrounds, and we bring that with us when we come into the space of school. When I look at culture, I just don't look at it as I'm black, you're white. We can also look at culture as family culture. My family culture may not be the same as your family culture. Your culture or your family may not necessarily always align with what school is asking you to do. And school culture may not always align with home. And sometimes when we communicate, we're passionate about that and we're bringing that all in one place when we're communicating between parents and teachers. Emotional barriers. If someone can answer, what would be an emotional barrier when it comes to communication in the school community? So transparent moment. I am not just an educator, but I am a parent. I have a student that is in grade 11. I have not always come to communicate with the right emotion, right? As I said before, as parents, we are sometimes very passionate about our children receiving education. And so when our children come home and tell us things, sometimes immediately, Mama Bear kicks in, Papa Bear kicks in, right? And when we're communicating that to teachers, whether we're communicating that to principal or teachers, sometimes we're communicating out of emotion instead of fact. Okay, so sometimes emotional barriers can be, I hear something and I immediately react. Same with teachers. Sometimes teachers, who are human, deal with different things out of emotion. And so anytime that we're talking about communication, it's always good to ask yourself, where am I? Emotionally, where am I? Because oftentimes conflict in communication in school comes from a place where I may not necessarily be understanding what someone is trying to communicate. What is more important, understanding or agreement when it comes to communication? Who says understanding? Who says agreement? Nice. Understanding should always be our first and foremost thing that we come into when we are communicating with one another. We often live in this world now where everyone has to be in agreement. And if I don't agree with you, and you don't agree with me, then we just can't work this out. But when we look at school communication, it's very important for us to always go in with understanding. How do we do that? By active listening. If I'm listening to someone, I'm not listening to respond, I'm listening as a parent to understand. And it is also the school's responsibility to understand where you're coming from as well. But in order for us to understand, we have to make sure that we're listening for understanding and not responding. Because oftentimes when we have this emotional barrier, what I'm saying, we're right? And we've all, can we just be honest, we've all been there, right? I'm coming into a situation for agreement, not necessarily understanding. And so in the school environment, what I have found to be helpful is that when, whether it's student-teacher, parent-teacher, teacher-to-teacher, it's always good to get an understanding of what's going on. Another barrier that can get in our way when it comes to communication, a lack of trust. Who's experienced a lack of trust in a school environment? Whether it be parent or even you as a student, who has ever experienced a lack of trust in a school environment? One of the biggest barriers, I would say one of the biggest barriers in school communication is trust. If I send my child to an institution, there should be a level of trust that I have for and in that institution, correct? When we send our children to school, what are we trusting? We are trusting that our children are getting educated. We are trusting that our children are safe. What else? Anyone? Treated fairly. Their needs are met. Specifically what? Learning. Social emotional needs. Sometimes we only look at the academic part, but a big part of a trusting environment, an educational trusting environment, is all needs are being met. Social, emotional, academic needs. But that's the partnership between parent and student. One of the things that helps with trust is transparency. Now that's a word in the Bermuda community I find to be tricky because the trust factor is a big thing. And confidentiality is a big thing. And so as a parent, if there's something that I have to communicate to my child's school, there is a fear that if I tell you my business of what's really going on with my child or in my home, is that going to get out? Has anyone had that apprehension about being transparent about what may be going on with your child? Thank you. I have found as an educator that transparency is one of the biggest barriers that can block school communication between parent and teachers. School, how can school be transparent? Well, school can be transparent by allowing us into a space where we're able to know what's going on in our child's school. Have you ever felt like sometimes you got something and it was a surprise? So a lot of times with transparency, schools have to be open about what's going on in school, and home has to be open about what's going on in home. How do we bridge that gap? Trust. We have to find someone in our school community that we trust. Can I ask a question? Did anyone have a bad experience in school and bring that experience into now you as a parent parenting your child? Would you like to share our incident, or did you just raise your hand? No. A lot of times as parents, transparent moment, it can sometimes something happens with our child, a teacher says something to our child, something is done, and it may trigger something that happened to us. And so instead of us looking at the incident or the communication that's been between our child and a teacher, we kind of take it on like, I remember that Ms. Smith did that to me when I was 5. And so now Ms. Smith, who's teaching my child, is not going to do that to my child. And so we have to make sure that when we are communicating and making sure that we're getting information, again, we are tapping into what emotion are we communicating from. So that now when we go to school, we're having productive conversations with our children's teacher. When we consider trust, consistency builds trust. But consistency can also break down trust. What do I mean by that? If I am consistent in the way that I move as an educator, if I am consistent in the way as I move as a parent, then I am building trust with my children's teachers. If they have a conversation with me and every time they communicate with me, they are getting the same result or same response, that's me building trust with my children's teachers. That can also break down if me as a parent are not also upholding my end of the bargain, right? And so the teacher or my children's teachers are asking me to do things that will enhance my child's educational experience, and if I'm not upholding my end of the bargain, that can also, the consistency of me not doing that can break down trust. It's the same with parents and teachers. Consistency across the board is something that always builds trust. If someone can tell you something, I can say that I like you, but if consistently every time you experience me, you experience an attitude from me, what does that tell me? What I'm saying doesn't match what I'm doing. And so in a school community, all around, parent, teacher, administrator, school body, consistency builds trust. And so then we're having conversations, when school we're having conversations with parents, and parent is having conversation with school, we have to make sure that what we're saying is matching what exactly it is that we're doing. A show of hands, who feels comfortable having open and transparent conversations with your school community at Bermuda Institute? Keep your hands up. PTA, if we can look around, parents, if we can look around, teachers, if we can look around. That's a good bit of us, right? Now, sometimes people say, well, we're speaking to the converted. That's wrong, because I feel like sometimes when we speak to the converted, our experience, we could help somebody that is having difficulty. And so if you know of a parent that is having difficulty with communication in the school community, have conversations on how it is that you have overcome some communication barriers with you, whether it be teacher or whether it be student. Active listening. And I'm sure we've all heard of active listening. As an educator, I find our children lack the skill of active listening. And so a lot of a teacher's day is spent talking and repeating instructions. 1, 2, 3 times. And so I have this rule that I consult with my teachers at my school that you give 1 instruction, you give 2 instruction, you give the 3rd instruction, and then there's a consequence. We have to create children that will grow into adults that will be able to go into a world and be able to effectively communicate. But part of our children learning how to communicate, they have to be good listeners. We live in a world, as I said before, where defending and responding is sometimes always our first go-to. Because if you say something to me that I don't like, I'm going to say something to you that you don't like, and sometimes it's a back and forth. When I did a presentation 2 months ago, one of the biggest things when it comes to communication, we always have to make sure that we are setting our example for our children. In my experience, we are raising a generation which is, on one hand, very good that they're able to express themselves, right? Because for most of us, we may have been raised in an era where you were seen and not heard. And so although communication with our children and giving our children their voice is a very positive thing, sometimes it can be used in a negative way, right? And so now we empower our children to say what they want to say when they don't like an instruction. But we have to make sure that when we're teaching our children about communication, it's always the thing that we've always heard it, it's time and place, right? And so a lot of times I heard my students say, well, that teacher didn't respect me. So I said, X, Y, and Z. Or my mama told me that if a teacher says something to me, I can say something back. But is that a realistic point of view in the world that we're sending our children to? You can nod your head as you do. The world that we're sending our children to says that when they go on a job, there is some type of, they're going to have to comply with some type of instruction. And so we have to be very clear when we are communicating to our children how they are to communicate with their teachers, that we are very clear as to what that looks like. Now there's a difference between advocacy and excuses. And I think sometimes we get it mixed up when we look at communication, because I can advocate for somebody. And I can say that Johnny was sleeping in class last night because there was a death in the family and he was up all night. As opposed to, don't give my child a detention because I had to work late and I can't supervise my child, and therefore if my child is to sleep in class, they're going to sleep in class, right? Advocacy is always about problem solving, and it's always about communicating something to get to a result. Excuses says that no matter what, my child or an adult or whatever, I just need you to give them a pass for what they're doing, whether disrespectful or not. When we're communicating, when teachers are communicating with us, or when teachers are communicating with our children, yes, there should be a level of respect. But sometimes communication between teacher and student can get muddy when we allow our children to think that they're on the same level as their teachers. Has anyone heard of Dr. Stephen Covey? Educator, businessman, author. And he had a quote about communication, which I think is, I think this will sum up my point for this evening. And it says, he said, if he were to summarize in one sentence the single most important principle he had learned in the field of interpersonal relations, it would be to seek first, to understand, and then to be understood. So when we look at our school community, we are in a school community where our focus is what? First and foremost, what is our focus? educating our students. How should we communicate? Transparently. Why should we communicate transparently? Transparency brings understanding. There were times when I had a student walk into my classroom and I was like, well, I've gone into a classroom and seen a student and I'm like, oh boy. But then I've had a conversation with that student and it brought understanding to the why. So even as adults, sometimes even as a teacher, and I'll be transparent, there's sometimes where I've interacted with a student and I'm like, it ain't no way that anything positive is going on at him. But then I've had to humble myself because once I met that parent and had a conversation with the parent, it brought understanding to the why. So if any takeaway that I want you to take from tonight is that when we are communicating, it's when we are trying to understand, it's not always about agreement. You and I can have a conversation and you can understand me and I can understand you and we can still walk away from that conversation and not necessarily be in agreement. And so agreement, although is the ultimate goal, understanding should be our first point of reference. Yes? Any questions? So before you leave, we have some chart paper off. And when I started, I asked just for a temperature check to see how are you feeling as far as communication. And I looked around and it was some 3s. I don't think I saw any 2s. Over on the side, we have chart paper, and it's basically what's working and what needs improvement. And so in order for us to improve, and in order for Bermuda Institute community to improve in communication, we need to know what that looks like, right? This is all part of communication. Anytime we're communicating with somebody and we're trying to get to a solution, we have to be specific about what it looks like. And so we're asking you to, before you leave, it's a box at the back with some papers that will be filled up. If you could just put down on that piece of paper what's working currently and what needs improvement, so that the PTA and the principal can look at those concerns, look at what's working, because if we already know what's working, what we need to work on is the improvements, okay? And so tonight, before you leave, we'll just ask that you can either fill out the charts, or if you don't want your answer up on the wall, you can put your paper into the box. If there's no other questions, thank you very much for having me, and I hope that you learned something this evening.